Okay, so I'm using this Zoom time to make some video because no one's here. But of course, if anybody does arrive, I will be taking questions. However, in order to use this time the best we can, I figured I'd just go ahead and make a recording. So what we have here is the pelvic and external genitalia anatomy of the male half of the reproductive system. And once again, having a Y chromosome and having the hormones that are secreted as a result of that during embryonic development is what results in this anatomy. So when I say male, I'm referring to the presumed gametic sex of this individual and the genitalia that they have as a result of that gametic sex. So none of this is to, for example, discount the existence of intersex people and their anatomy, which absolutely do exist. It's just that for the baseline, we need to know the two main ways the development trajectory takes before we can begin examining in between stuff. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and, if I can I? Doesn't look like I can hide the annotations on this one, but that's, well, actually, let me see if I can. Nope, they don't appear to be working. That's fine though. I don't need them. I just wanted to make the numbers go away. Okay, so like we did with the female reproductive system video, I'm just going to go ahead and first set the baseline by establishing direction. So this is anterior. This is posterior. This is superior. And this is inferior. So now you have an idea of which structures are where. I also want to take an extra step because unlike in the female reproductive system, in the male reproductive system, there are elements of it that hang outside of the pelvic cavity and are pendulous or protruding. So these are, of course, the penis and testicles. So this little sort of divider line that I'm making here, all the stuff that's in the middle there, let's make a bigger dot. So all the stuff that I'm highlighting here, how about an even bigger dot? There we go, is inside of the pelvis. So everything in the blue highlighted region is in the pelvis. And then everything that is out, not highlighted, is outside of the pelvis. So this is, of course, part of the penis, but as you can see, not actually all of it. There's a significant portion of the erectile tissues of the penis that actually are back in the pelvis. So only part of it extends beyond the pelvis. And then we also have, of course, the testes and epididymis inside of the scrotum, which is a protective bag of skin that also has a strong role in thermoregulation of the testes. And so we will talk about that this video. Okay, so let's get some basic anatomy out of the way. I'm going to turn, so we're looking at the posterior aspect. So this is from the back. So this thing is the urinary bladder. And then these two tubes plugging into the bladder are the ureters. And these are going to be the tubes that carry urine into the bladder from the kidneys. And actually, I'm going to take a brief pause from labeling that because the attachment of the ureters to the bladder is a little bit higher than it should be, but I digress. We'll talk about that when we get to the urinary system. So anyway, the urinary bladder is a good landmark because on the back of it, you can find all kinds of stuff that's related to the male reproductive system, specifically to the creation of semen. So on the back here, these two little guys are the seminal vesicles, also called the seminal glands, because that's actually what they do. They're a gland, they make an exocrine secretion. You can say either on a lab practical. If you're in my class, either is fine. Just know that they're synonymous. So very often in anatomy, things have 2 or even sometimes 4 names for the same structure, which is frustrating for students. So I try to just let you know all of the names so that you know which ones are interchangeable. And if you run into a different term on the internet and you're like, I thought it was the seminal gland or whatever, you'll just be aware that those things are synonymous. Okay, so those are the seminal vesicles. And up here, see this little tube that's kind of looping around, and it hooks over the ureter and heads backwards to plug into the back of the bladder. So this is the proximal end of the vas deferens. And again, here's another synonymous term. It's also called the ductus deferens. So ductus deferens or vas deferens, either is fine. And then you can see the vas deferens widens where it starts to go back and meet the other seminal glands. So the vas deferens, of course, is going to be carrying spermatozoa, which are the sex cells. But spermatozoa by themselves would not survive the female reproductive tract, and they wouldn't have the energy that they need to swim and a whole bunch of other stuff. So it's not good enough to just ejaculate spermatozoa. They need to come with sort of a care package for them in the form of seminal fluid, which has a bunch of stuff in it that helps spermatozoa try to do their job. So that's kind of the rationale here, and we'll be talking about the components of semen as we move through this as well. So we're going to kind of mix and match the anatomy portion and the physiology portion a little bit. So this widened area is the ampulla of the vas deferens, and ampulla is a word that you'll see a bunch, which is just the name for when a narrow tube widens. Widened region of narrow tube. Perfect. Okay, so that's what the ampulla is. I'm just pointing it out because, you know, it's very obvious on this illustration. That's not actually a thing that's on my students' lab lists, but I like to point out some of the stuff that's not, because I don't want students mistaking those items that are not on the list for items that are, you know. All right, inferior to that is the prostate gland, which is here. And the prostate adds additional fluid to the semen. So the contributions of the seminal glands are things like food and fuel for the spermatozoa. So there is glycogen, there is vitamin C, there is fibrinogen. There's all kinds of stuff in there. So fuel, antioxidants, a clotting agent, and I'll explain why the semen would need to clot at all in a little bit. If you're surprised by that, don't be, it has a purpose. And then the prostate gland is going to secrete a sort of thinner, the seminal vesicle secretions are rather thick, thinner, sort of milky, alkaline secretion. And the alkaline is kind of important, and I realize I picked the wrong blue for this, so let's just do this instead. Okay. Sorry about that. I realized that was like not at all visible. So the alkalinity is important here because the vagina is a very acidic environment due to the healthy bacterial communities that are home, or that call the vagina home. Those are supposed to be there, they're good. They help to keep the vagina self-cleaning and free of, stuff that could make that organ or structure sick. But sperm are really vulnerable to low pH, to acidic pHs, and it kills them without much difficulty. So the alkaline secretion of the prostate gland, is going to function as sort of a buffer to that. So that's that on that. So as you can see, the ampulla of the vas deferens meets with the seminal vesicle duct, and they both enter into the prostate in the form of the ejaculatory duct and then join up with the prostatic urethra. So let me kind of draw that. So here's the prostatic urethra. And then on either side, there's this combined, I'll make it orange, combined seminal fluid and spermatozoa, seminal fluid and spermatozoa. And then those join up with the prostatic urethra, which is of course just the urethra that's running through the prostate. And then the prostate gland is able to add its contribution. Et voila, we've got a complete set of components necessary for the creation of functional semen. Okay, so let's go look at things from the side. Turning. Okay. I thought this had, Well, it doesn't, but it should be there. There is actually a leftover of some components involved with your belly button that attach to the front of the bladder, like so, but it's not pictured in this illustration. The reason I mention it is because it has clinical relevance. Sometimes the bladder doesn't form completely during development, and there's a sort of a pouch instead of a collapsed ligament that was once an opening, and that can cause urological problems for folks with that condition. So I was hoping to show you that, but I can't, so I'll just describe it. Okay, so let's do our anatomy from the side now. So this is the side view of the seminal vesicle. Here is the side view of the prostate. And here, let me draw it in pink, I like the bright one, is the ductus deferens, which travels up the spermatic cord, over the top of the bladder, hooks behind the ureter, and joins up in the back. Okay, so that's that stuff. This little portion of the urethra right here that has the 8 on it. So after the prostatic urethra, which I'll draw. So the prostatic urethra is the one running through the prostate. The brief bit of the urethra that is bare and is passing actually through the pelvic floor and the skeletal muscles of the pelvic floor is the membranous urethra. And it's called membranous because it passes through a membrane sort of web-like floor of muscle. And this is actually what gives you voluntary control over urination. So if you were to be trying to hold it, for example, you would be contracting the pelvic floor muscles on either side of this to basically just pinch that tube shut so you don't urinate when it's not a socially appropriate context to do so. And then the urethra that's running through the bottom erectile tissue of the penis, which is called the corpus spongiosum, we call that part of their urethra the spongy urethra or the penile urethra. So spongy reflects the fact that it's running through the bottom erectile tissue, which is the corpus spongiosum, which just means spongy body. And then penile reflects the fact that that corpus spongiosum is, of course, part of the penis. So again, interchangeable terms, either is fine. All right. And then we have, let's do green. This white structure is, of course, a testis. This is the singular form. Testes is plural. So if I were to turn this anteriorly and you could see both of them at once, I would label them and say testes, but testis is singular. And this is an important point for my students at Clark College, because of course, spelling counts on our lab practicals. And one aspect of unambiguous medical communication is, of course, the ability to say what you mean very specifically. And so for that reason, pluralization does matter. Sorry, I'm just taking a sip of my beverage because I get dry mouth from talking so much. Okay, so that's the testis. And then on top of that is this sort of comma-shaped structure, which is the, oh, that's a terrible color for that. Let's actually make that line longer. The epididymis. And this tends to be a tricky one for spelling because people want to spell it M-U-S at the end, but it's not, it's epididymis. So lots of I's. So just as you're talking about the epididymis and practicing spelling it, just make sure that you are not saying you and you're saying I at the end there. Okay, so let's go over the functions of these things that we haven't mentioned yet. So of course, the testis is where spermatozoa are made. So let's say spermatozoa factory. And also testosterone is produced in the testis as a result of control from hypothalamic and pituitary hormones. But ultimately, the location where testosterone is being synthesized is in the testis. Okay, so then the epididymis, its function, which I'm going to erase membranous urethra so I can fill that in. So the epididymis function is to, basically it's like a staging area. Area is spelled with an A at the end. Staging area for complete spermatozoa. And they also hang out in that area. And while they do not swim out, that's a common misconception that many people have, is that sperm are swimming before they exit the male reproductive tract. That's just not true. However, they do need to kind of flex and wiggle their flagella to like kind of make sure, you know, all the parts are working and get it ready to go. And so you do see some of that action happening in the epididymis. It's like if the testis is elementary school and high school for spermatozoa, the epididymis is college. They're almost ready to go and, you know, go forth and do their job. So I'm going to actually zoom in on the epididymis and the testis real quick here so I can point out some features of them. Oh no. Oh geez. I want to move this downward. There we go. Okay. So as you can see from this picture, the epididymis is sitting on top of each testis. And I really wish I could look at the medial aspect so that these vascular structures aren't in the way. There we go. I think that's the best we can do. So it sits on top right here. And then turning further, let's do a slightly inferior view. You can see that it descends downward and then it makes a sharp turn. And that is actually the dividing line between the epididymis and the vas deferens. So the epididymis is a coiled structure made of like bunched up tubes. And then it inferiorly, it straightens out and turns a corner and just gives rise to the vas deferens. So that's how those two structures are related. So the top part of the epididymis that is more wide, we call the head of the epididymis, and the part that is descending and straightening out is called the tail. Okay, so let's now talk about the, spermatic cord. And there we go. Okay. So I'm going to draw the body wall again. Well, it's more like this. Hold on. There, like that. So this group of structures, and unfortunately it doesn't include two things that it should include, but I think that would just clutter the illustration. So that's why the illustrators chose to leave it off. But I'm going to encircle it. So this circle is encircling the vas deferens, the testicular artery, and a network of veins called the pampiniform plexus. And this cluster also contains lymphatic vessels and nerves, but those have not been pictured. But we call that group of structures the spermatic chord. And so the spermatic chord is one of the structures on our list, and it also has a bunch of functional significances, including but not limited to, of course, spermatozoa have to ascend within the vas deferens to ultimately take this big roller coaster loop and end up getting out via the penis. But of course, the very metabolically active testis, because it's busy always doing mitosis and meiosis, is of course going to need oxygen and nutrients, just like any other metabolically active, highly regenerative tissue. So we've got an artery in there, and then a cool network of veins called the pampiniform plexus. So the reason that this is significant is a variety of things, but one of them is that during embryonic development, the testes are actually on the back body wall. And as development progresses, let's draw a little path for the testis here. So the testis in a developing fetus is back here. And then during development, the testis moves down and out through a hole in the body wall called the inguinal canal. So this is just a little perforated spot in the anterior abdominal musculature and connective tissues through which the testes need to descend to enter the scrotum. And it also leaves a weak patch in the interior body wall in males. So this is why there's a sex difference in the prevalence of what's called an inguinal hernia, which is where, due to usually lifting stuff incorrectly, a little loop of intestine will pop out through that hole under the skin. And that's a common problem. It's also pretty easily repaired. But the reason for that problem and its specificity to males is because the testes have to descend out through that hole. Okay, so let's talk about thermoregulation, and then I'll talk about the penis. So thermoregulation, and I said that to somebody the other day, and they were like, whoa, that's a big word. I don't know what that means. And it occurred to me that I was like, oh, not everybody knows the things that I know. Right. So let's define thermoregulation first. So thermo means heat, and regulation is what it sounds like: to manage or modify or regulate. So thermoregulation does sound like a long word, but really all it means is like, we have to manage our body temperature. And in the case of the testes, specifically, the testes have some special thermoregulatory needs that are accomplished by two things. And I'll talk about those two main things. But in general, the idea is that spermatogenesis and its success, so the production of successful viable sperm, requires that the testes be maintained at a temperature that is 1 to 3 degrees C lower than body temperature, which is on average 37. So in addition to spermatozoa being very vulnerable to acid, they're also very vulnerable to heat. And so something has to be done about that. So the scrotum, which is the muscular bag of skin and connective tissue, and again, muscle that encloses both of the testes. The scrotum actually exists and it hangs outside of the body to accomplish this goal. And there's two muscles of the scrotum that accomplish this goal. Unfortunately, again, they're not pictured here. The cremaster muscle is one aspect of the spermatic cord that's also not pictured, but I'll kind of draw it in. So the cremaster muscle is a muscular basket that distally wraps around each testis and proximally extends upward like so. So if it is warm, so let's write that over here. If hot, the cremaster relaxes. And that moves the testes away from the body, cooling them down. If cold, let's make that blue because, you know, hot and cold, dichotomous, whatever. If cold, cremaster contracts, and that moves the testes up closer to the body to warm them up. Sorry, I paused for a second because one of my pigs just got into the kiddie pool and he's playing with the hose while laying in the kiddie pool, and it's really cute. All right, distraction over. So that's the significance of the cremaster muscle. And it's also why we see these pretty radical changes in the testes, depending on, of course, temperature. So there's a reason why if somebody is going to say like jump in a freezing lake, they might experience their scrotum contracting and bringing the testes in to their body, versus during a very hot day, they might find that their scrotum is very relaxed, and that is just kind of move the testes away from the warm body. There's also a muscle on the outside of that, which I'll illustrate in a different color. And this is a really thin muscle that's like just in the scrotum, so it doesn't extend up. So it's just under the scrotal skin. And this is called the dartos muscle. And the dartos muscle is the one that aids in contraction of the testes by changing the texture of the scrotal skin. So basically, like if you were to be in a cold environment where the testes would be needing to be moved closer to the body, what you would also see was that the testicular skin is going to sort of crinkle up. And then when the dartos muscle is relaxed, the skin is slack and it's not all crinkled up. So the dartos muscle plus the cremaster muscle are involved in moving the scrotum around for thermoregulation. And that's really cool, but it's not quite as cool as this situation. So the vessels. So I'm going to kind of draw in the schematic of this vascular arrangement, and I'll do it in cross section and in longitudinal section. So here's cross section. Got an artery, and then a bunch of veins that are all interconnected with each other, wrapping around that artery and surrounding it. So that's what it looks like in cross section. So I'll just label that cross section. And then in longitudinal section, it looks like this. And I'm going to make a simplified version of it because I have some ulterior motives here. Oops, wrong color. There we go. Okay, so we got our artery, and our artery is carrying very warm blood down to the testis. And we already established that the testis needs to be cooler by a little bit in order to have spermatogenesis be successful and result in viable sperm, because our sperm are vulnerable to heat. So if they must receive blood, and they must because it's got oxygen and nutrients and all kinds of good stuff in it, but that blood is hot, we have a dilemma, right? So we have a nutritive substance coming down the pike, but it is very warm, and that's a problem. How do we cool it down? Well, if you surround that basically hot water pipe with a network of veins. And these veins have just been in the testis. And the testis is cooler on purpose. So the veins are going to be carrying cooled blood back up. And the artery is going to be carrying hot blood down. Here's the thing. This is just a law of thermodynamics, nothing fancy, but I'm tired of these little stupid background labely thingies. I'm going to just make myself a little place to write here. Okay. So one of the laws is that heat energy moves from areas of high temp to areas of low temp. So it's kind of like diffusion, but for heat. If you have a lot of heat energy in one place and less heat energy in a neighboring place, the heat energy is going to dissipate from the warm place to the less warm place, moving down its energy gradient. So if you put tubes next to each other and one of them's carrying heat and the other one is not carrying as much heat, the heat, which I'll make be yellow, I guess, is going to move from the warm artery blood into the cooled venous blood. Now, I'm not saying that the blood is moving. I'm saying the heat from the blood, the thermal energy in the blood being carried down the artery, is going to move as it descends through this sort of hallway of cooler vein tubes. The heat is going to move into the cooled blood coming back up from the testis. And what this functions as is a counter current, so moving in opposite directions, heat exchanger. Not unlike the heat exchanger that makes your fridge cold and heat exchangers and all kinds of other thermally related appliances. So air conditioners, for example, it's hot now, we're going to all use them. And guess what? They're heat exchangers. So is this. So by the time that the blood in the testicular and deferential artery gets down to the testis, it's been cooled down so that it doesn't boil the spermatozoa as they try to be formed, which is amazing. So it's this really simple arrangement of arteries and veins that gives rise to this really powerful heat exchanger that helps maintain the testes at the temperature they need to be at and not heat them up. Super, super cool. So obviously, I think that's amazing. I'm a physiologist, so of course I do. That's why I sound jazzed about it. So I'm hoping that you all are as jazzed about that cool fact as I am. Okay, so let's go look at the penis now. And I'm going to turn it to the front. Okay, so anteriorly, we've got the glans penis, which is the expanded end of the corpus spongiosum. And then on top of that, and not actually connected to it, so separate from that, are the two, and I'll do the plural and the singular form so you have an example of each. So this is one corpus cavernosum. And if I were to label both of them like so, two ex corpora cavernosa. So in Latin, if you're trying to pluralize something with two parts, so corpus means body and cavernosum means cavernous, because the erectile tissues have little caverns that fill with blood. So instead of just saying, adding an S to the end of something like we do in English, in Latin, you make the first part plural. So this means bodies, and then cavernous, but conjugated for plurality. The body's cavernous. So that's how to make sense of that terminology. Getting used to Latin pluralizations takes a little bit of elbow grease, but it is super achievable. So I believe you can do it. Okay, so let's look at this stuff from the side. So here's the rest of the corpus spongiosum and one of the corpora cavernosa. So one corpus cavernosum, and then glans penis. And ordinarily, it's kind of like a ghostly rendering of it around here. You can kind of see. So when people with this anatomy are born, there is a flap of skin or like a surrounding of skin. I'm sorry, there's a very loud airplane going over. I'm going to pause the recording while the airplane makes its, oh, it's a helicopter. Okay, it'll be gone soon. Anyway, there's this skin covering, and that's because the glans penis, like the glans clitoris, has tons of nerve endings. It's really sensitive. And so if it were to be bumping into stuff all day, that would be uncomfortable. So the covering is called the prepuce, or the foreskin. And that just helps keep the glands from getting overstimulated and therefore desensitized. The clitoris, the glands of the clitoris has a prepuce as well, which is sometimes called the clitoral hood because of the difference in arrangement, but it's all the same parts. Okay, so that's that stuff. And then let me turn this. Nope. This is fun. Okay, we're going to move this into the middle and then turn it like so, carefully. Sorry, this is like a little bit tricky to navigate. And then we're going to move it down. Okay, there we go. I'll make it a little bit bigger. So, as I mentioned previously, the part of the penis that is outside of the body cavity is actually only part of it. It's not all of it. And so you can see the root of the penis, which is the very, very back part of the corpus spongiosum, is right there. And then we've got 1, 2 crus of corpora cavernosa. Crus means leg. So it's just the little legs of the corpora cavernosa, which actually they do kind of look like legs here. So that makes sense. Okay. So that's that stuff. Not pictured here are 2 muscles that are important for ejaculation. And those are, I'll just kind of summarize them. The bulbospongiosus muscle and the ischiocavernosus muscle. And so what I'm going to do is kind of like take this little box here and explain kind of what they are for. And then after that, I will sort of draw them in so that you can understand what I'm talking about. So oh, no. Forgot. It erases everything if you touch it. So if I want to correct something when I'm in this mode, I have to just color over it with white. Ta-da. And ischiocavernosus muscle. Okay, so these two muscles are playing a role in intromission and, importantly, ejaculation. Okay, sorry about that. I had to pause for a second to deal with some barnyard drama, but it's all good now. Okay, so the ischiocavernosus muscle, ischio should suggest to you that maybe it's related to the ischium of the pelvis, and indeed it is. And then cavernosus should suggest to you that it might have something to do with the corpora cavernosa. It does. So what the ischiocavernosus muscles, there's one per side, one wrapped around each crew of the corpora cavernosa, is it contracts to compress the rear portion of corpora cavernosa to add rigidity to erection. So basically, if these fill with blood during a penile erection, and we want to make it even more turgid to achieve intromission, squeezing the back half of it so all the blood has to move forward is going to really help with that goal. So that's what that does. The bulbospongiosus muscle, so bulb means root, and spongiosus refers to the corpus spongiosum. So this muscle, there's actually two, one per side, but they kind of pair up and wrap around the root of the penis. So they wrap around the penile root and rhythmically contract during orgasm and ejaculation. And the purpose of that is that's how ejaculation is actually achieved. So if you have a bunch of fluid in the penile urethra, so it's all like sitting here, emission is the series of events of secretion that secrete semen prior to ejaculation, and ejaculation is the ejection of that fluid out of the penis. So during sexual activity, semen is accumulating in here due to parasympathetic stimulation. So parasympathetic organs parasympathetic stimulation of glands specifically. And then when ejaculation needs to occur, the bulbospongiosus muscle contracts forcefully and rhythmically around all sides of this so that the bolus of semen is moved out. So that's what those are for. So let me turn this model around and I'll do some drawing. Oh, once again, we have to do this weird pivot thing that I hate and I find difficult. Okay. And then let's move you up. Perfecto. Okay, so I'm just going to kind of draw over the top of this and let's test and see how visible this is. Yeah, it's pretty good. Okay, so there's like a white seam of fascia. And then the two halves, or the two separate, bulbospongiosus muscles are arranged like that. And then the ischiocavernosus attaches posteriorly to the ischium and it wraps around the crew of each corpus cavernosum. So again, ischiocavernosus muscles are responsible for adding extra rigidity to the erection of the penis, specifically the exterior portion of the penis, to achieve intromission, which is the scientific word for the insertion of one sex organ into another, in this case, a penis into a vagina. And then the bulbospongiosus muscle is responsible for actually expelling the semen when it's time for the semen to be expelled. So that's what the purpose of those muscles is. All right, so that concludes the anatomical portion of this video. I do want to make a couple clinical applications notes before we conclude. So clinical application note number 1. Prostate cancer is a pretty common cancer in people with this anatomy. Because the prostate is a gland, that means it's made of epithelial tissue. And as we all know, epithelial tissue is highly regenerative. And the more times a tissue does mitosis or has its cells do mitosis, the higher the likelihood that there's going to be a genetic accident, which gives rise to cancer. It's just a fact of generative tissues. There is very robust evidence to show, though, that regular ejaculation has a preventive role in prostate cancer. So that's just a fact. So stagnation of that gland and the necessity to turn over the cells and then just not do anything with the secretion creates the possibility for cancer. But it really appears that if regular ejaculation is achieved, then that cancer risk goes way down. So that's that on that. The other clinical note I want to make is one that is especially relevant right now because a lot of people are talking about this procedure, and that is, of course, a vasectomy. So let's talk about what a vasectomy is, because there's a lot of myths swirling around, and I want to dispel them. So first thing to know about a vasectomy is it is not the removal of the testes. I can't believe I have to say that, but I do, because I've heard other people say that. And liken vasectomy to castration, which it is absolutely not. So don't let anybody tell you that. So during a vasectomy, vas refers to vas deferens. So during a vasectomy, here's what happens. An incision is made in the scrotum, pretty close to the body wall. And then using a probe, just the vas deferens is brought out in a loop. So if you were to look at this procedure, what it would look like if this is the skin at the top of the scrotum, and this is an incision, very small incision, and this is a surgical probe. The vas deferens is over the probe. So basically they just go hook the vas deferens up through the hole, slice it, and then seal off the ends. So you get this little tiny bit of tube as your compensation for the vasectomy. If you ask, they'll give it to you in a little jar of formaldehyde. But this is the segment of the tube that gets removed. And then these two ends are ligated, which just means they're shut. And all that does is just prevents sperm from getting out. So it does not affect the seminal vesicles, and it does not affect the prostate or the role of those glands in emission. All it does is prevent spermatozoa from being a component of semen. So it also doesn't prevent ejaculation or sexual activity. All it does is prevents spermatozoa from getting out. And because you still have all the tubing, it's possible to reverse vasectomies and religate the tubes to put them back together in the event that somebody changes their mind and decides that they do want to try to conceive a new human being. So it is reversible. It's not irreversible. It's certainly not castration. And it's also a day procedure. So you get local anesthetic and numbing. You are awake for it. It doesn't take very long. It's not especially invasive. You usually go home the same day, and then the protocol is just pain medication, anti-inflammatories, and ice and rest. That's it. Not scary, not traumatic, just a little snip and you're done. And I've had friends who have had this procedure, and I've picked them up from the clinic, and I just, like a good friend, showed up with a bag of frozen peas and a towel and 800 milligram ibuprofens and was like, all right, let's get you home. And they were right back to life as usual the next day. So nothing to be afraid of, and lots of myths dispelled about that. And then finally, one quick note that I forgot to say when I was talking about the corpus spongiosum. So the corpora cavernosa are the main contribution to erection. So they both fill with blood. They let more blood in than they let out, and that's how they become turgid and rigid. And then, of course, the ischiocavernosus muscle contracts around them to make that even more rigid. The corpus spongiosum still gets erect, but far less so. And of course, the reason for that is the urethra, which is going to be where the semen needs to pass through, has to stay open. We can't have a structure that becomes so rigid that it shuts the passageway, because that would defeat the purpose of intromission and sexual intercourse. So it doesn't get quite as rigid for that reason. We want to keep that urethra nice and open. Okay. Oh, one more thing that I forgot, because it's not pictured in the illustration, which I find to be annoying. I'm glad I remembered before I stopped. Yeah, they're just not there at all. Okay, well, I'll turn this sucker around. So there are two glands coming off the side here, which are called the bulbourethral or Cowper's glands. And these also contribute to the process of emission. Specifically, they actually make most of their secretions prior to ejaculation. And that's because, of course, the urethra also carries urine. And guess what urine is? Acidic. Our kidneys are our biggest player in removing extra acid from our body by peeing it out. And that's why the pH of our urine is lower than the pH of our blood. So again, sperm are vulnerable to acid. We can't have that, which means that any old urea or protons or acidity in the urethra, we want to clear that out before the spermatozoa pass through to give them the best chance of survival, right? So these produce a clear, thick mucus substance that basically clears the urethra of anything that might be remaining of urine, and just makes sure that the passageway is safe for spermatozoa to pass through inside of the semen. The other function of the bulbourethral or Cowper's glands is, of course, it emerges during the human sexual response from the tip of the penis, from the end of the glands, and that functions to lubricate the glands, which eases intromission. Now, there's these same glands in the female pelvis, which are on either side of the vaginal opening, and they produce the same stuff. So during the human sexual response, if two people are having intercourse, both parties are biologically contributing to facilitating intromission. So that's the point of that. And I do want to make a public service announcement because this is another common misconception, because sex education in the United States is really not that great. Especially if, you know, if sex is discussed in the context outside of its purpose for reproduction, and I'm just going to go ahead and acknowledge this here, because we're all adults. People have sex for reasons other than procreation. Let's just be real. But there's this misconception about whether or not the pre-ejaculate, which is what these glands make, can it contain sperm? And the answer is yes. Now, the likelihood of those being the sperm that successfully fertilize an egg is pretty low, but not impossible. And so even if the contraceptive method of choice for a pair of humans is just withdrawal of the penis prior to ejaculation, that doesn't guarantee that fertilization can't occur. The pre-ejaculate can contain sperm, and if that sperm is savvy and lucky, that sperm can fertilize an egg. So don't let anybody tell you otherwise. This is true. And don't let anybody lie to you about vasectomies or what they mean. And make sure that you're taking care of your pelvic and urogenital health. And that is all I have to say about that. So I will see you guys in the next video. Thank you so much for your attention. I know this was a little bit long, but I hope it was thorough and provides everybody with good and useful information. All right, and that's that.